Okay, so my presentation is about the Apache Indian tribe, and kind of the reason I wanted to do this tribe is because this past summer I had an internship where I spent a couple months living on the hospital property at the White Mountain Apache Reservation. So I've kind of got to see firsthand how the healthcare system works there and also how the public health system works, which was super awesome. And so that is the main reason I wanted to talk about them. So just some population statistics is there's about 30,000 members that associate with one of the Apache tribes, and they live mostly in 4 states. So most of them are in the southwest of the US, which is the Arizona, New Mexico, Texas area, but there are a couple tribes that live in Oklahoma. And there are 5 total reservations that have mainly Apache on them, which is the Fort Apache, which is where I was, and then there's the San Carlos and the Tonto Apache, which are also in Arizona, and then the Mescalera and Chicoya Apache are both in New Mexico. And then the contact they had with the US started around the late 17th century. That's when they first kind of had documentation of the contact, but that is when there was Apache military that started raiding Spanish villages and also American villages that were close to them. And then starting in 1861, there was 25 years of war, which were known as the Apache Wars. And this lasted until about 1886, but at that point, that's when most of the Apache military kind of surrendered and they moved to reservations, but there were some Apache leaders, as you can see in this picture, that's Geronimo, and he and a couple other Apache resistance leaders continued to lead raids, but eventually the Americans overpowered, and the resisting Apache were actually evacuated and imprisoned, and they were moved to Florida and then later to Alabama. And that's kind of the reason that there are some Apache groups in Oklahoma, because they migrated out of that southwest because they were evacuated and in prison. And when they were in prison, there was a lot of spread of malaria and tuberculosis and also malnutrition. And Geronimo actually died before they released the Apache that were there back to, a lot of them to go back to their homeland or where they moved into Oklahoma. And so that was one of the reasons that there was a lot of a big decrease in Apache population, was this huge long war and also a lot of mistreatment. But when they moved back to the reservations, I mean, as most Native American tribes, there were schools implemented by the US government which kind of tried to assimilate them, and that actually led to some of the cultural things. So on the Apache reservation, they do speak Apachean, but that's mainly spoken by the elders because the younger generation isn't being taught as much because they're being taught English so they can go to school outside of the reservation and gain a better education there. But that actually comes up in the healthcare system a lot because there's not many that speak Apachean anymore, so there needs to be those translators and interpreters. And so one of the programs I saw that was implemented it's called CHR, which is Community Health Representers. And basically they take and train natives to help with healthcare things such as translating in the hospitals and interpreting, and they also help deliver medicine or kind of just be that support for people that need it when they can't get the medical care exactly they need. Another cultural value, it's kind of talked about by Peter, but they do have a really big family importance and they live in multi-generational homes most of the time. And so this was a big problem with COVID because Native Americans, especially the Apache Nation, had really high transmission rates of COVID because they lived in these houses with multiple generations. And so it was really hard for them to quarantine from their family. So when one person got it in the household, it kind of just spread to everyone. And that was dangerous because a lot of the time there were elders living in the houses as well as young children. And so it's really cool to see the importance of family and how close they've all become, but it also sometimes is an issue with public health and medical things. But it's also important to remember that in a hospital, do want like extended family input, and there's a lot of decision making that involves their family. And then one of the interesting things I found, particularly with the Apache Nation, is that there's a like specific postmarital relationship that the husband has with his wife's family, especially between like the husband and his mother-in-law. There's this form of like avoidance, and they don't really speak to each other. So I mean, you can see there's the importance of family, but it's also important for like healthcare to remember that if you're dealing with like a husband, you don't really want to have the wife's family input because of this postmarital relationship. And then the Apache religion has a lot of spiritual beliefs, and spiritual healing is just as important as physical healing. They have shamans and herbal medicine and stuff like that. So it's super important just to remember and not only focus on the physical illness that's at hand, but also for physicians on the reservations to remember that they need to address the spiritual needs and discuss with their patients if they've gone through any spiritual healing processes as well as medical processes. And then there has been a little bit of a distrust with modern medicine, and I was thinking specifically about vaccination because a lot of the Native American tribes in the past were kind of used as just like vaccination trials. And so that was something I saw firsthand, is there's been a resistance in getting the COVID vaccine because they don't have this like complete trust in the Western medicine and government. So that was super interesting to see too. With my profile, I already kind of talked about communication issues with the language and also extended family, but one of the major issues I saw was a lack of transportation because a lot of the families don't have a car, and the hospital I was at was one of the only hospitals on that reservation, and so people were, I mean, as close as like 2-3 minutes away, but they were also like 2-3 hours away. And so that causes a lot of issues if they need like immediate medical care or follow-up appointments or to pick up medication. And so one of the solutions I saw on this reservation is they kind of had taxi services almost, but they did this mainly because of COVID, because they needed people to be transported for testing and their follow-up appointments and to pick up aspirin and all this stuff. And so they hired a lot of these companies to become kind of like taxi services on the reservation so they could get people to and from the hospital and get them the medical care they needed. And then I didn't have a slide for the books, but there is a book that was written by Eve Ball, and she's a native of the Apache Reservation, and she, before oral tradition was really written down, she interviewed a bunch of elders of the Apache, and she compiled it all into a big book. And that's one of the, like, I think it'd be super interesting just to read through the elder view of their Apache religion and kind of just see their culture from that point of view. So that's my presentation on the Apache.